Welcome back to Living Beyond Sunday, the podcast where we talk about living the Christian life. My name is Jonathan Sams. I'm back here with Pastor Mike. And Pastor Mike, as I was driving here this morning, I was listening to a news story about how Israel had started to begin to set the date for an invasion of Gaza. And so for those of you listening or watching now, we have seen a horrendous attack from Hamas onto the nation state of Israel. And now Israel has claimed that they're going to invade Gaza in response to that. And I think that there's lots of people out there with lots of different takes on this, but I wanted to give you the chance to talk about it from an angle of what we should do as Christians. Is there a response for us to have as Christians in our day-to-day lives? Should we be prepping for the end times? All of stuff that I think is whirling out there that I wanted to give you the chance to explain or express your opinion on.
Yeah, that's good. Where do you want to start? Because there's a lot of topics.
Let's start with just this idea, or this whole idea of the end times, because there's people out there that have said and will continue to say that this is the precipice of Revelation and the end times, which, spoiler alert, I don't think is true. We've been in the end times. I think we learned that in 1 John. But what do you think? Like, should we be looking at this as a fulfillment of prophecy to look to the end times?
Yeah, I mean, to your point, in 1 John, we are in the last hour. I mean, he's really clear on that. And we see, tons of references to the last hour, and the last hour being post Jesus' resurrection, the time before, or the time after his resurrection until he returns is the last hour. So yes, we are in the end times, and we'll be there. I think there's some unique imagery when you look back at Jesus talking about the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, when he's predicting that, and what we get is kind of an echo of what we see in Revelation of what will happen in the end. And part of the thing that we see in that is really clear is wars and rumors of wars. The challenge is we've always had wars and we've always had rumors of wars. And so, I don't know that that's enough to calculate down to where like, oh my gosh, this is it. This is the time. I think for me, though, the thing that it has reminded me of in the midst of this is just the validity of Scripture. And we see that the war that's happening right now, and I was actually talking to a buddy of mine that I work out with who's Jewish, and we were talking about the nature of the fact this is actually, a holy or religious war that traces all the way back to Abraham. And so I think just the validity of being able to trace this back, like historically, to Abraham and seeing all of the connecting lines and how there's still the enmity that exists there, to me brings validity to God's word, and also reminds me that in the same way we look back in the past and see the truth unfolding, the future will also be the same truth and the unfolding of it. And so one of the things that struck me is just being reminded of like, man, Jesus is going to return. And whether or not it's tomorrow or in 6 months, 6 weeks, or 6 years or 600 years, he's going to return. And so it's really kind of, just awaken my mind to that reality. And I think about, and I talked about this in 1 John, we looked at the last hour, but it's some 318 times the reference of Jesus' return is mentioned in the New Testament. And it's used as a motivation and a means to remind people, keep your eyes on up above what's happening and look at the reality of what's coming. And so for me, it's been just a reminder of that, that Jesus will return at some point. And man, we need to live in light of his return. And so is it a marker of the end times? I don't know. I'm very speculatory when it comes to that. I come up from a culture where everybody, is predicting, 18 reasons why
Right.
Jesus is going to return in 2018 or whatever. And, so I don't know about that, but what I do know is it should be an awakening to us to say, man, Scripture's real, it's valid, it's right. And if it's been right in the past, it's going to be right in the future.
Yeah, that's really good. So you mentioned this idea that it's a holy war, and it's interesting because I'm sure anyone listening has heard some sort of take from multiple different sides on this whole thing. And there's kind of two ways that I've seen different sides of this perspective try to couch this. And it's a holy war. It's just about land. And generally the side of the leaning pro-Palestinian will say it's just about the land. And generally the other side, the very more pro-Israel side, to say this is holy war. How do we as Christians approach this from a perspective? Because I think you and I, we were talking before this, we don't want innocent civilians dying, whether they're Palestinians or whether they're Jews. And so how do we approach this as Christians going, well, it seems like it's just about land, but there does seem to be this biblical reference. What would you say Christians should do today when they're thinking through how they form opinions about this?
Yeah, that's really good. And I think what's so sad, and again, talking to my buddy that is Jewish, it's what we both agreed on is just everything is so polarizing.
Yeah.
And so now you have groups politically aligning with certain sides. Mainly, you see a lot of the left, some of the left that's leaning toward Palestine and this select group, and it's like people are going, what's going on? And everything is so polarizing. Everybody feels like they've got to take this hardline stance. They've got to do these things. And I think it's really challenging. What I would say is, that you can be for in support of Israel, right? And their right to the land and their right to protect themselves. And at the same time, also be for the innocent civilians that exist in Palestine. I know that we actually have Christian, even Baptist roots that go on the mission field into Palestine. So we know that there's Christians in Palestine. We know that there's a church in Palestine, right? There's things that have been happening there in Palestine. And so we've got to be mindful. Like, it's not just all of one and none of the other. It's, yeah, we can stand with Israel, which I think is an appropriate stance to take. And at the same time but I also am very much for the innocent civilians, and I don't want to see the loss of lives. We don't want to see casualty. What we ultimately want is peace. Now, we know that peace won't come and won't happen until Jesus returns, but man, we want to long for that peace to happen and pray in light of that. And so I think that's how we need to look at this thing. And this should not be a polarizing issue when it comes to just simply looking at, man, we care for life and we care for the Imago Dei.
Yeah, and talk a little bit about that, because I think from like this podcast exists to help talk about what it means for our Christian lives today. And I think you've seen, there's Christians who are coming down on different sides of this, whether it's a more sympathetic position towards Palestine or a more sympathetic position towards Israel. How should we as Christians approach each other as brother and sisters that hold to the same faith but are having different perspectives on this?
Yeah, it's unfortunate because this shouldn't be a divisive issue. To be about life and to be against the innocent slaughtering of any individuals, that's just a biblical thing. I mean, you look at Micah 6:8 to love justice and walk humbly with your God. Like, we want to be at peace with one another, and we want to see those things happen, one and the same. And it's like, I feel like this is such a polarizing issue, and it's unfortunate. I think for us as Christians, what we should do is stand in the gap and not allow it to be a polarizing issue. To say, hey, I can stand with Israel and I can stand against the mass slaughtering that happened on the grounds of Israel, and there's a whole just war theory that's behind the potential for them to be able to invade Gaza and do their thing. But at the same time, I don't want to see the massacre of Gaza, right? I don't want to see the massacre of all Palestinians. Do I want to see justice happen? Yeah, but I want to see it happen in the right way, and it play out in the right way. And so I think as Christians, we've got to fight against this become a polarization. And also, man, I'll just say this, we've got to fight against this being a distraction. I think this is very easy for people to spend way more time on social media and diving into this than they are sharing the gospel with their lost friend.
Yeah, that's really good.
And I mean, at the end of the day, that's what matters in this the most. I mean, what's going to happen is what's going to happen, and we can pray and we can be empathetic. But at the end of the day, we can't allow these cultural moments to be such distractions that it derails the church or creates divisiveness. I'm teaching through Titus right now, and one of the things in Titus 3 that's strongly warned against is divisiveness in the church. The enemy loves division. The spirit of the Antichrist, we talked about in 1 John, is a spirit of deception and division, right? And so if it can bring deception and division in the church, it brings chaos and confusion and distraction from the mission and the ministry. We don't want that to be the case. And so while we should be praying, while we should be active about, man, we want to see justice, and we should be empathetic toward the loss of any human life, at the same time, we go, man, we're going to pray for that. We effectively can't do anything toward that end. And so we don't want to spend all of our effort, all of our time glued to our phone, glued to the TV. And I'm not saying be not informed, be informed, but at the same time, don't be distracted from the main purpose of why we exist. And that's to know God and make him known in the process.
Yeah, that's good. And especially since, like you said, there's not practical things that we're not suiting up to go to Israel. We are here as American citizens in our context. And so there's a certain aspect that this can be a distraction, especially when we allude to like the end times language that's out there. For depending on your eschatology, your view of the end times, you could have different views on what this means. And I found that culture that would view it in that light tends to kind of want to make you shell up and clam up and prepare for the end times. And it distracts you from what we think you should be doing. Talk a little bit about this. So we've talked about how we should maybe view it in light of it. How should we, are there things we need to do other than pray? Like, should we be advocating to our legislature? Should we be really talking about this and really dialoguing about this more frequently? Is there stuff that we should do as Christians in light of what's going on over there?
Yeah, I mean, some of that is your Christian conscience. What do you feel compelled to do? What are your convictions to do to fight for justice or speak for justice or, to create aid and help? I think one of the things we can do, and this is why I love being a Baptist, is that the Baptists have mobilized faster than anybody. In fact, the Dallas Baptist men were the first people on site and mobilized to the greatest degree over there. They're actually on the ground right now serving meals and making sure they're taking care of folks. And so through our cooperative giving as Baptists, Great Commission Baptist, we're able to invest into that and help see that aid form. Sin relief is another arm of the Great Commission Baptist that we're able to kind of lean into. And so, given to your local church, if you're part of the Baptist Cooperation Church, then man, you're giving to help support this aid and to be there. And so to show up in that capacity is huge. So I think provide any chance to be able to provide care and aid is big. Prayer is big. And then I think the other piece is with your conscience as it relates to legislator and the legislation and those kind of things. You've really got to listen to your conscience and say, man, how much of this should I speak to? Should I not? What do I feel compelled and convicted to be able to do? Again, for the sake of humanity, advancement of the gospel, we want to be active in the public square, but our goal in the public square is different than a lot of other people as Christians. We have a different perspective and a different pursuit when it comes to our goal. It's, man, we want to do what's best for humanity, the flourishing of humanity, so that we can see the advancement of the gospel. And so, yeah, I think those are some of the things that I would say you could be able to do. As far as should you speak out against these issues, man, I just think we have to be careful in this. I think a lot of conversations happen best in person. I think, trying to just broadcast things on social media, one of the things I've seen and learned from that I've seen done the wrong way is people coming out really quick before they have all the information, posting things really fast, and then having to backtrack. And I think we live in a culture with social media, tons of perspectives, tons of things that aren't actually accurate or true, whether from individuals or agencies. We've got to vet through all that stuff and say, is this the most helpful platform? Like, what does this actually accomplish by me posting something and saying this or saying that or getting in some sort of big debate? And again, talking to my buddy that was Jewish, he said the same thing. He goes, man, it's a waste of time to get on these forums and feel like you've got to fight and argue with somebody you don't even know. And at the end of the day, what do you accomplish other than wasting 2 or 3 hours?
Right.
And so I do think we've got to be mindful of that. As far as the speaking outside, people feel like, well, I've got to make my peace. And it's like, well, do you? Is that the platform now? Is everybody, like, is part of the expectation now that if you have social media, you must make a statement every time something cultural happens? I would push against that and say, man, I think these conversations happen best like what we're doing here within the context of your local church. If you're interested, what can we do? Go talk to your pastors and elders, talk to leaders in your church. For those that are in image church, I would say, man, your giving is helping fuel the mission that's happening over there right now.
Right.
With Dallas Baptist Men, Sin Relief. There's so many other organizations that are over there helping out.
Yeah, that's really good. I think that I've seen a lot of the reaction kind of initially, people jump to conclusions, want to put their post out there of which side they're more on. And then more and more facts come out. You either have to backtrack, or it's distracting from a lot of the Christian organizations that are going in there as humanitarian relief, because I think the facts have come out that humanitarian relief is very much restricted in that area. And
Right.
We've seen that specifically some of the Great Commission Baptist organizations like Send Relief are on the forefront of being able to deliver that aid,
Right.
which is awesome and should be celebrated. What about as a pastor of a local church? You talked about a little bit about the giving here, but what should people who are maybe in ministry or adjacent to ministries, should they be approaching this topic with the people they're discipling, people who are in DNA groups, community groups? Should community groups in churches be setting aside time to talk about this or pray specifically for Jerusalem and Israel? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's a tough one. It could go either way in some places. I do think you've got to be careful as it relates to, is that the purpose of the gathering? I think one of the things that we want to do is we always want to pray for peace. We always be aware. In our church, we're very aware of things happen culturally, and we'll take 1 or 2 moments to pray and spend time asking for God's will to be done on earth as it is in heaven. I think spending too much time on it, again, can become a distraction. I think we've got to be mindful if we're going to spend time on it. It needs to direct our eyes to the reality of one day Jesus is going to return. One day there will be peace. Are you ready for that return? Because that's where Jesus angles, right? When he talks about all his parables, when he talks about the return and what that looks like, all of it is, are you ready? When I come back, will you be ready? And so I think for us, if anything, it should be an indicator wherever you are eschatologically, wherever you are, kind of on that side is, man, we want to be aware of Jesus' return will happen. Are you ready for that? I think setting aside too much time, starts to align you in some political ways or cultural ways that you're going, man, is that most helpful? Do we do that with everything else? How many things do you do that with? That's one of the things we always ask as church leadership of, man, we can't speak to every single thing that happens in our world. There's so much depravity and darkness.
Right.
And so, what things do you speak to? What things do you not? This is obviously a hot topic issue that is very much world renowned as people look at this. It's world news. So I think taking time to be able to pray for it is helpful. And can be healthy for the church. I think as far as coming out with this is where we stand as a church and all those kind of things can be unhelpful. I think one of the greatest pieces of this to speak to that I'll say on here as well is speaking against any sort of racism as it relates to any kind of anti-Semitism or anything like that, where it's like, or on either side, anti-Palestine, we don't want to be anti-people, right? Like we don't ever want to see that kind of division or divisiveness happen. So we want to speak toward unity, and I think the church can put that on display in a lot of ways and speak to what the gospel compels us to do, is that even if you disagree, right, in so many capacities, it doesn't mean that you hate people that just look like folks from those different parts of the area or mobilize to that end. So I do think it's one of the things to be reminded of in the church on the importance of Christian unity and what that looks like and how we can live out life together and try to put that on display.
Yeah, and I think that, tell me if you would agree with this, I just think that the what's happening over there is a kind of presents a challenge for us to not only pray for peace, but to pray for and realize that Jesus was described as the Prince of Peace, and that the only way in which we'll see true peace come between the nation of Israel and Palestinians is if they're both looking to Christ as their Messiah. We know that Israel currently, the majority of ethnic Israel right now does not believe Jesus is the Messiah, and certainly Hamas and the Palestinians generally don't as well. And so I think another kind of angle to this is, Jesus, would you save people in both camps? And we could see real reconciliation come through that.
Big time. And I go back to the conversation I had with my friend, and I told him, I said, man, he was not a Messianic Jew to my understanding from him. And I went back and I just said, man, the thing that gives me hope in the midst of all this chaos is I believe Jesus really is the Son of God, and that he is going to return, and he's going to make all things new. And that's the one hope I have in the midst of this destruction and turmoil, and as horrific as it is. That's where my hope lies. And I think that's where our minds have got to go. All is not lost. Hope is not gone. Jesus will return, and so we've got to be reminded of that. And in the meantime, yes, we want to pray for peace. We want to be proactive as much as we can, and we want to say, and it's okay to say, man, we can stand with Israel and say, man, we don't support the attacks that have happened there. We speak out against any kind of terrorism in any capacity. And at the same time, we're also not for the slaughtering of folks that are in Palestine that are any innocent civilians. While at the same time saying we want justice for Israel against Hamas.
Yeah,
those
really
things
good.
are okay to say.
Yeah, that's really good. What else, like in closing thoughts, when it comes to encouragement or whatnot? Because I know that a lot of people have seen this and they've been anxious, worried, nervous about what may come. Do you have any encouragements or ways, thoughts for those individuals that are seeing this and going, man, maybe it is the end times. I'm kind of worried about this. I'm anxious about the future. What encouragement would you give for those people?
Yeah, I mean, perfect love drives out fear in 1 John. And I think being reminded of the perfect love that we've received in Christ, knowing that we don't have to live in fear. And one of the things 1 John talks about continually is when the judgment does come, I mean, you don't have to walk in fear. You can have confidence. And so I think the beauty of Christianity is in the midst of the chaos of the broken world, there's a confidence that we can have where we're pointed to the reality that God's in control. Like none of this is, God's not up there going, oh my gosh, I got to figure this thing out. Let me work the puzzle pieces. How do I make this? He's sovereign and he's in control of all this. None of this has caught him off guard. None of this is reactionary and he's trying to react. He knows exactly what's going to happen. Though we may not know the future, we know the one who holds the future.
Right.
And there's a confidence that we can have in the midst of this is it scary? Sure. Is it confusing? Yeah. Does it make you think about potentially, is it the end? Sure. But at the end of the day, God's in control. Jesus will return. And for those that are Christians, be at peace. Don't allow this to captivate your mind or your heart. We've got to take our thoughts captive, even in these kind of things, when it comes to fear, when it comes to anxieties that maybe this might ensue in us. We've got to take those things captive and go, those are not from Christ. God is not a God of confusion. He doesn't want you to sit there and be disillusioned or fearful. He wants you to be confident, knowing that he's in control and that the one who's in you is greater than the one who's in the world, and that those that are his, nobody can take him out of his hand, and he's going to return for his people one day.
Yeah, that's really good, and I think that's a good way to close. For those of you listening, if you have questions, please feel free to email us, Pastor Mike at imageatl.com. We'd love to do a follow-up and answer any questions you may have for Pastor Mike on this issue. Also, this is the first time I'll just speak to it. We're putting this on YouTube, and so that's a big one. So if you're watching on YouTube for the first time, please feel free to like, subscribe. We're looking forward to putting these out as a video each time we do them every other week. With that being said, if you haven't followed us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, whatever you're listening to, please feel free to do that and share it with a friend. And like I said, if you have questions, send us an email. Pastor Mike, thank you as always for the time.
Absolutely.
I look forward to doing it again in a couple weeks.